was described as quiet, a loner, the kind of person you wouldn't look at twice. But behind a mask of chilling normalcy, a horrifying obsession was growing. He wasn't born a monster, he became one step by step in the quiet woods of Ohio and the lonely apartments of Milwaukee. How did a man so dangerously adrift slip through every crack in society? And what does his story teach us about the darkness that can hide behind a neighbor's door? This is the story of the most infamous serial killer in the history, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. Outwardly, they were a typical middle-class family. Lionel was a research chemist, while Joyce worked as a teletype instructor. But tension ran beneath the surface. Frequent arguments, emotional instability, and a sense of detachment marked the household. Jeffrey, the elder of two boys, seemed to grow increasingly distant as he aged. After undergoing surgery at 4, his personality shifted. Once outgoing, he became quiet and withdrawn. When the family relocated from Milwaukee to Doylestown, Ohio, and eventually to Bath Township, Jeffrey became more isolated, turning away from social interaction. In the rural woods near their home, his curiosity took an unusual form. Fascinated by anatomy and the inner workings of living things, he began collecting animal bones and studying decomposition. His father, a scientist, once showed him how to preserve specimens, an innocent gesture that had unexpected consequences. Jeffrey would later reflect that he wasn't trying to be cruel. He was searching for what lay beneath. By high school, he was drifting. Struggling with his identity in a conservative town, he found himself increasingly alienated. He began drinking heavily, numbing a growing internal conflict. Few around him understood what he was going through, and fewer still noticed the storm building beneath his quiet demeanor. The 1970s were an unforgiving time for a young man questioning his place in the world. Homosexuality had only recently been declassified as a mental disorder. In a small insular town, being different meant hiding, and Jeffrey, hiding his struggles, his loneliness, and a growing obsession with control, slipped through the cracks. His parents' bitter divorce in 1977 fractured the last of his support system. His mother left with his younger brother. His father moved to a nearby motel. At just 18 years old, Jeffrey was left alone in the family home, untethered, unnoticed, and dangerously adrift. In June 1978, weeks after graduation, Jeffrey encountered Steven Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker on his way to a concert. The two returned to the house to hang out, but when Steven tried to leave, a confrontation occurred, one that turned irreversible. In the days that followed, Jeffrey attempted to cover what had happened. Steven Hicks's disappearance would remain a mystery for over a decade. Jeffrey briefly enrolled at Ohio State University, but soon dropped out. In 1979, his father suggested the army, and Jeffrey enlisted. Stationed in Germany as a medic, he initially performed well, but his behavior became erratic, driven in part by alcohol dependence. In 1981, he was discharged. Fellow soldiers would later recount troubling experiences, but no formal action was taken at the time. He drifted from Miami, where he held a short-lived job, back to Ohio, where he was arrested for public intoxication. Eventually, he moved in with his grandmother, Catherine, in West Allis, Wisconsin, in what many hoped would be a turning point. Living under her roof brought some structure. He held a job at the Ambrosia chocolate factory and began attending church with her. Outwardly, things seemed stable, but inwardly, his need for control was growing. He began frequenting local bars and venues, seeking connection but feeling increasingly out of place. Several troubling incidents followed. He was banned from a local facility after questionable behavior, and in 1986 he was arrested for indecent exposure. In 1987, nearly a decade after the incident with Steven Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer's impulses resurfaced. After meeting 24-year-old Stephen Tuomi at a Milwaukee bar, the two rented a hotel room. The next morning, Tuomi was gone, the result, Dahmer later said, of a blackout he claimed not to remember. What followed was a series of events that marked the start of a terrible pattern. Dahmer began targeting young men who were alone, often from marginalized communities, offering money or companionship. He sought ways to keep them from leaving, and as time went on, he took increasing steps to maintain total control. When his grandmother grew suspicious of his late nights and strange behavior, she asked him to move out. He relocated to apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, a place that, for the next 2 years, would become central to a series of tragic disappearances. By 1990, Dahmer had created an isolated world behind his apartment door. There, he meticulously controlled his environment, planning encounters with increasing deliberation. He kept records, photos, and mementos. His goal was connection, but on his terms alone. Between 1990 and 1991, he took the lives of 12 more individuals. The patterns were chillingly similar. Luring individuals from public places, offering safety or payment, and then ensuring they could not leave. Victims included Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strota, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konerak Sinthasomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. One case stood out, a moment where the system might have intervened. In May 1991, a young teenage boy managed to leave the apartment in a confused state. Concerned bystanders called 911, pleading with police to help. Officers arrived, but were persuaded by Dahmer that this was a domestic misunderstanding between consenting adults. Despite the witnesses' pleas, the individual was returned to Dahmer's custody. He did not survive. By mid-1991, Dahmer was falling apart. He was fired from his job for repeated absences and faced eviction. His actions became increasingly erratic, and those who lived nearby began to complain of strange odors and unsettling noises. Yet the transient nature of the neighborhood and a lack of urgency from authorities allowed him to continue unchecked. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, a man who mostly kept to himself. Few could have imagined what was happening inside apartment 213. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer invited 32-year-old Tracy Edwards to his apartment. Almost immediately, Edwards sensed that something was wrong. A foul odor lingered in the air, a horror movie played on repeat, and the mood was deeply disturbing. When Dahmer attempted to restrain him, Edwards fought back and escaped, flagging down police. What followed was a discovery that shocked the nation. Inside the apartment, officers found photo evidence and materials that suggested long-standing criminal activity. The apartment was sealed off. Investigators unearthed deeply troubling evidence of what had occurred there. Over the next 60 hours, Dahmer gave a full confession. He admitted to the deaths of 17 individuals, beginning with Steven Hicks and ending just weeks prior. In 1992, Dahmer was charged with 15 murders in Wisconsin and 1 in Ohio.
As to count 1, the court will impose a mandatory life sentence plus an additional 10 years on the habitual criminality. Count 2, life imprisonment plus 10 years consecutive to count 1. Count 3, life imprisonment with the date of parole eligibility 70 years from the inception of that particular sentence. I don't have all the numbers that I can't work it out, but it'll be 70 years from the beginning of that sentence, which will be consecutive to count 2. Count 4, life imprisonment with a parole eligibility to be 70 years from the commencement of that sentence, consecutive. Where am I at on the numbers? Somebody has to. What, Madam Reporter, what was the last? I should check this off on here. So last four was the last one? Okay. Count 5, life imprisonment, parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 4. Count 6, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 5. Count 7, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 6. Count 8, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 7. Count 9, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 8. Count 10, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 9. Count 11, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 10. Count 12, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 11. Count 13, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 12. Count 14, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 13. Count 15, life imprisonment with parole eligibility to be 70 years after the inception of that sentence to be consecutive to count 14.
Victims' families filled the courtroom. One, Rita Isbell, delivered a powerful, emotional statement that became a defining moment of the trial.
My name is Rita Isbell, and I'm the oldest sister of Errol Lindsay. Whatever your name is, Satan, I'm mad. This is how you act when you are out of control. I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you, mother. I hate you!
On February 15th, 1992, the jury found him sane and guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 16 life terms, totaling 957 years. At Columbia Correctional Institution, he expressed remorse and underwent a religious conversion. On November 28, 1994, another inmate, Christopher Scarver, fatally attacked Dahmer. He died at the age of 34. Milwaukee was left with more than headlines. It faced the painful task of confronting its own systemic failures. The Oxford apartments were demolished in 1992. The families of the victims demanded change. Advocacy groups called for better police training, more attention to missing persons reports, and reforms in how authorities respond to vulnerable communities. Some changes were made. Others remain ongoing challenges. Jeffrey Dahmer's story continues to be told in books, documentaries, and streaming series. Critics warn of glamorization. Supporters of such media argue that the goal is to understand and never forget. Psychologists have analyzed his past, a childhood of isolation, identity suppression, and emotional trauma. But Dahmer himself accepted responsibility. "I knew what I was doing," he once said. He was not a monster in the movies. He was a man unnoticed for too long, hiding in plain sight. And the real story is not just about him. It's about the lives that were lost, remembering the victims. Let us remember them: Steven Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, James Dockstater, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konerak Sinthasomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. They were sons, brothers, and friends. Their lives mattered. Which case should we cover next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.